6 tools. That is what an outdoor store will sell you today, to get one person through a long weekend in wild country. A skinning knife shaped for one animal, a folding saw, a hatchet, a fire rod in its own pouch, a multi-tool for repairs, and a fixed blade heavy enough to split wood, priced like jewelry. 6 purchases, 6 sheaths, 6 things to lose. Now set all of that beside a single line of handwriting from 1826. It survives in the Articles of Agreement between William Henry Ashley and the partnership of Jedediah Smith, David Jackson, and William Sublette, fixing what the men working the Rocky Mountains would pay for the goods hauled out to them. Only one kind of knife appears anywhere on it. Butcher knives. 75 cents each. Not a frontier pattern. Not a legend. A butcher knife, priced like a small convenience, sitting on the same page as powder and lead and blankets. That is the tool a whole industry ran on. Skinning, carving, cooking, repairing, and on the worst days, the last thing a man had left in his hand. And the blade most people are picturing right now, the heavy one, with the brass guard and the swept clip point, is almost certainly not the blade those men were carrying. This is not a story about old steel being better than new steel. It wasn't. A modern boning knife will break down an elk faster than any trade blade could. The story is stranger. It is about what happens when a tool is cheap enough to abuse, plain enough to replace, and carried so constantly the man holding it stops thinking about it at all. That is where the 6 jobs come from, not from the steel. And the tool only makes sense once the arithmetic of these men's lives does. In February of 1822, an advertisement ran in a St. Louis paper called the Missouri Gazette and Public Advertiser. It was addressed to enterprising young men, and it asked for 100 of them to ascend the River Missouri to its source, to be employed there for 1, 2, or 3 years. That is the entire pitch. No wages, no description of the country. Just a river, a direction, and a span of years long enough that anyone reading it in a river town understood exactly what was being asked. Some of the names that answered are names the West is still built on. Jedediah Smith, William Sublette, Jim Bridger, who was a teenager. Within a decade, that group had walked over most of the mountain country no government expedition had yet mapped. They were working men, chasing an animal, and the reason was hats. Felt made from beaver, underfur held its shape better than anything else available to European hatters. A rodent in a cold stream in what is now Wyoming was being killed to satisfy a fashion 4,000 miles away. Ashley's real invention was not trapping, it was logistics. Instead of sending men back down the river every year to sell furs and buy supplies, he took the store to them. Once each summer a supply caravan rolled west to a prearranged valley, and everyone came in. That gathering was called the rendezvous, and it ran from 1825 until 1840. For a few weeks, the middle of nowhere became a marketplace with prices, and prices get written down. Written down things survive. Ashley's own accounts from that first rendezvous list: what goods cost out in the mountains. A blanket, $9. Powder, $1.50. Coffee, $2. Tobacco, $1.50. And knives, at 75 cents. Look at that order again, because it is the whole argument. The blanket a man slept under cost 12 times what the knife cost. The morning coffee cost nearly 3 times what the knife cost. At the 1827 gathering, beaver was moving at around $3 a pound. So the arithmetic runs like this. A quarter pound of fur bought the tool that had made every one of those pelts possible. That is the imbalance sitting at the center of this whole story. The cheapest working item in the pack was the one item that touched every hour of the day. Now, about that blade. There is no single mountain man knife. There never was. That idea is a modern one, and it flattens something far more interesting. The men in that country carried whatever the trade brought them, and the trade brought a mess of patterns. Butcher knives, trade knives, blades from Sheffield and from France, shipped in by the dozen, simple working knives from local blacksmiths, some reworked from old files because good steel was worth saving. Overall, The butcher pattern dominated. Not because anyone designed it for the frontier, but because it was already being mass-produced for kitchens on the other side of the Atlantic. It was cheap, and it happened to be shaped correctly for the single most valuable task in the mountains. Which brings us to a word that has confused people for 2 centuries. In the supply lists of the period, alongside butcher knives, you find another category: scalping knives. The modern ear hears that and pictures something ceremonial, something made for one horrifying purpose. That is not what the term meant. Carl Russell spent more than 30 years on this material. He held a doctorate from the University of Michigan, served 34 years with the National Park Service, and wrote the reference work that still anchors the field, built out of trapper journals, fur company ledgers, and the catalogs of the ironmongers who supplied them. His conclusion about the scalping knife is blunt. It was a trade term, a commercial category. In practice, he described it as any cheap butcher knife. The name was a label on an invoice, not a description of a purpose. Charles Hanson, of the Museum of the Fur Trade, went further and reconstructed the pattern from period correspondence, including notes tied to Alexander Mackenzie and Company, a partner house of the Northwest Company. What he describes is almost disappointingly ordinary. A blade of 6 or 7 inches, straight or barely curved. A back left thick and unsharpened, a point at the end, and from it the sharpened edge running back in a long curve toward the grip. Read that again with a trapper's job in mind. An unsharpened spine you can push against with the heel of your hand. A long curved belly that follows the shape of an animal, a point fine enough to work around a joint. That is not a weapon that happened to be used for skinning. It is a skinning tool that got a frightening name from a merchant's ledger. And the most famous frontier knife in American memory shows up late enough to have missed most of this era entirely. John Russell was born in Greenfield, Massachusetts, made money in cotton in Georgia, and came home wanting to build something American. He had no background in cutlery. He was pulled toward it by a book about the workshops of Sheffield, England, which then held a near monopoly on the knives crossing the Atlantic. He began manufacturing tools and cutlery in 1834. His factory burned. When he rebuilt, he put the new works on the Green River, in Massachusetts, for the water power, and in 1836, that plant took the name that would end up stamped into the American language: Green River Works. By 1837, he was undercutting the English on price, without losing on quality. Now line those dates up against the calendar of the mountains. The rendezvous began in 1825. By the time Green River knives were reaching the Rockies as trade goods, most likely around 1838 or 39, and some historians argue not until 1840, the beaver trade was already dying. Silk had replaced felt in European fashion. The streams had been trapped out. The last rendezvous was held in 1840. The knife that American memory hands to the mountain man arrived at the funeral. None of that makes the Green River knife a fraud. It earned every bit of its reputation, moving west with settlers, hide hunters, and traders through the 1840s and beyond, until the phrase "up to Green River" meant, in plain American speech, done right. It simply earned that reputation in the era after the one it gets credited for. The knife history remembers is not always the knife that started the story. So what did the plain one actually do? 6 jobs, and every one of them comes with a limit that the legend usually leaves out. The first job was money. A beaver pelt was not a trophy, it was currency, and its value depended almost entirely on the condition of the skin. A cut through the hide, a patch of flesh left on, a tear at the edge, and the pelt dropped a grade. The animal had been trapped, hauled, and processed for nothing. The work was closer to careful dissection than butchery. Open the hide, work the blade between skin and the fat beneath, separate the two without going through either, then scrape the flesh side clean, slower and more tedious than the skinning ever was. Then the skin went onto a bent willow hoop to dry. This is where that long curved edge earns its price. The curve lets a man work by rolling the blade instead of stabbing with it, which is the difference between separating a hide and ruining one. The limit is real. That edge would not hold through a full morning. Carbon steel of the period dulled steadily against hide and grit, which is why a stone was as much a part of the kit as the knife. A blade sharpened that often does not stay the shape it left the factory with. A man's entire year rode on the quality of a cut, not on the beauty of the tool. The second job was food. Mountain men ate what the country gave them: elk, deer, bison, and in season the beaver itself. Roasted beaver tail was considered a genuine luxury out there, and exactly what a body burning through a cold day in high country needs. The same blade that opened the hide now broke the animal into pieces a man could carry, hang, or cook. The limit is obvious to anyone who has done it. A dedicated boning knife is better. A blade sharpened thin for skinning is not ideal around joints and bone, and pushing it there damages the edge you need tomorrow morning. So why not carry both? Because the nearest replacement for anything was measured in hundreds of miles and a season of waiting. Two specialized tools that each do one job well are worth less, out there, than one adequate tool that never leaves your belt. The third job was shelter, not construction. Control. Here is where the legend usually overreaches, so let's be exact. Mountain men had axes and tomahawks. Those items sit right there in the supply inventories alongside the knives, and nobody was felling timber with 6 inches of butcher steel. What the knife did was everything the axe was too blunt for: cutting stakes to a point, notching a pole so another locks into it, splitting small dry wood, slicing rawhide into lashing, which is the thread that actually held a frontier camp together, because rawhide shrinks as it dries and pulls a joint tighter than any knot. The limit is that a knife used as a wedge is being asked to do the one thing blades are worst at. Lateral force is how they break. Every man out there knew it and did it anyway, because the alternative was standing in weather. In a wet October at 8,000 feet, a dry night is the difference between working the next morning and not. The fourth job was fire, and this is where the myth needs correcting most. The knife did not make fire. We know that with certainty, because fire steels appear as their own line item in the trade accounts, bought and paid for separately. A striking steel and a piece of flint were standard equipment, carried in the possibles bag with the rest of a man's essentials. What the knife did was turn a wet forest into something a spark could catch, scraping bark into a fine, dry nest, shaving standing wood into feathered curls that take a flame and hold it long enough to matter, splitting a dead branch to reach the dry heart when everything outside is soaked. In cold, wet country, the problem is never finding wood. It is finding wood that will burn. So the honest version is not that one blade replaced a fire kit. It is that without the blade, the fire kit was a rock and a piece of metal next to a pile of wet timber. The fifth job was keeping the rest of the gear alive. A trapper's steel traps lived in freezing water. Springs took a set. Chains corroded. Trigger pans packed with silt, and traps were not casually replaced. They were heavy forged goods, freighted in from the east, at real cost, and a man whose traps stopped working was a man whose income stopped with them. Again, the records keep us honest. Files show up in the supply lists too, specifically for trap work. Nobody was pretending a knife was a blacksmith shop. The knife was the improvisation tool, buying time until a man reached someone with an anvil. The limit is that using a blade as a pry bar is another slow way to destroy it, and everyone out there accepted that trade. Which is, quietly, the most important fact in this story, and we will come back to it. The sixth job was the one nobody wanted. A flintlock gave a man one shot. Everything after that was a reloading sequence measured in unhurried seconds, in a situation that was not offering any. So when the rifle was empty, the knife on the belt was what remained. Let's be precise, because the popular version turns this into swordplay, and it was nothing of the kind. These were not fighting knives. They were kitchen-pattern working blades in the hands of men whose skill was in skinning. A last resort is not a strategy. It is what is left when the strategy has already failed. It shaped how a man moved through that country anyway. Now hold all six together and notice what they share. Not one of them requires an excellent knife. Every one of them requires an available knife, Which brings us to the thing modern collectors get exactly backwards. The blades that sit in museum cases and private collections now, cleaned and labeled and behind glass, were consumables. They were bought by the dozen, hauled west by the crate, and used until they were gone. You can see it in the survivors. Original frontier knives frequently show blades ground down far past their factory profile, narrowed and reshaped by thousands of passes on a stone until the silhouette no longer matches the one that left Sheffield or Massachusetts. Handles split and were replaced with whatever wood was at hand. Broken blades were shortened and put back to work. At Fort Union, on the Upper Missouri, archaeologists working ahead of the site's reconstruction recovered on the order of 1 million objects from the fur trade decades. Not treasures. Refuse. The material record of ordinary people using ordinary things until they wore out. And this is the hinge of the whole story. A tool that costs 75 cents is a tool you are willing to ruin. You will pry with it. You will let it rust and grind the rust away and lose 1/8 of an inch of blade doing it and think nothing of it because another one comes in on the next caravan for less than a pound of coffee. Versatility was not a design achievement, it was permission. Compare that with the knife most people watching this own. Something with a name, a warranty, a price that made you pause. Something too good to abuse. So it sits in a drawer, perfectly sharp, having never been asked to do anything difficult. Cheap steel that gets used becomes 6 tools. Excellent steel that gets protected becomes an ornament. And then there is the other side of it. What that 75-cent object was worth on the day it was gone. In the late summer of 1823, a hired hunter named Hugh Glass was working ahead of a party on the Grand River, in what is now South Dakota, and walked into a grizzly with cubs. The mauling was catastrophic, and here it is worth being careful. The earliest surviving account, published in 1825 in a Philadelphia journal called The Portfolio, says the party came up and shot the animal as it stood over him. The versions where Glass fights the bear off alone with a blade come later, added by other hands. That account was written by James Hall, who had the story secondhand from men who had heard Glass tell it. Glass himself left nothing. Historians working this material, including John Coleman, who wrote the modern scholarly study of the legend, treat the whole tradition as something shaped almost from the moment it happened. Which is fine. The Hugh Glass story does not need the additions. Strip it back to what the earliest telling supports, and what is left is this: a badly injured man, far from anything, judged unlikely to survive. 2 men paid to stay with him until he died. And a decision, after several days, that he was taking too long and the country was too dangerous to keep waiting. They left, and they took his equipment with them, his rifle, his shooting supplies, and his knife. Think about what that subtraction does to a person in that place. He cannot hunt. He cannot process anything he might find already dead. He cannot cut a steak, a pole, or a strip of hide. He cannot make dry shavings, so even with a striking steel he has no fire. He cannot cut cloth for a wound, or wood for a splint. Every one of the 6 jobs goes dark at once. A man lying in cold grass on the northern plains in autumn, with a broken leg and open wounds, and the object standing between him and all of that capability, was worth about a 1/4 pound of beaver fur. What he did next is the part everyone knows. He crawled. He kept going. He reached Fort Kiowa, roughly 200 miles away, after weeks. Along the route he was helped by Lakota people, who gave him supplies and a hide boat, a detail the legend tends to lose because it complicates the picture of the solitary American surviving alone. The story is extraordinary without a single thing added to it, and it is the strongest possible argument for the value of the cheapest item on Ashley's price list. You never see what a tool is worth until you have to live without it. There is one more blade that belongs in this story, briefly, because it is the one that stole the frontier's image. On a sandbar near Natchez in September of 1827, a duel between 2 other men collapsed into a general brawl, and Jim Bowie killed a man with a large knife. The newspapers carried it nationwide, and within a few years the word Bowie was operating as a product category. But the knife at that fight was not yet the knife on the posters. Resin Bowie, Jim's brother, who claimed the original design, described it in his own words as a simple hunting knife. The heavy clip point, the crossguard, the silver fittings, the theater of it, all of that came afterward from cutlers answering a market the newspapers had created. So two American blades run in parallel through the same decades. One got famous for 90 seconds of violence and grew more ornate every year after. The other cost 75 cents, never got a name, and quietly made the West's entire fur economy possible. Guess which one ended up on the poster? Now, the fair version of the modern comparison, because the easy version is a lie. Modern specialized gear is better. A dedicated skinner skins better. A saw cuts better. A fire rod throws sparks in conditions that would defeat flint and steel. Anyone claiming otherwise is selling nostalgia. The mountain men were not solving for performance. They were solving a different equation, and every term in it was harsh. Weight, on an animal already loaded with traps and powder. Availability, when the nearest replacement was a season away. Repairability, when the shop was 500 miles behind you. And skill, the only input they could increase for free. Under those constraints, versatility does not just win. It is the only thing that can. A modern hunter with a truck and a hardware store has no reason to make one blade do 6 jobs, and there is nothing wrong with that. But that comparison, 6 modern tools against 1 cheap blade, still leaves something out. And it is the thing that actually did the work. The 7th tool was the man holding the knife. That is not a metaphor. It is the mechanism. Steel does not have versatility. Steel has a shape. What made a butcher blade into 6 tools was a man who had used it several thousand times. Who knew the exact angle at which it stopped cutting hide and started cutting through it? Who could hear when the edge was going? Who knew which jobs would damage it and chose to do them anyway, with full knowledge of the cost? That knowledge is not in the object. It cannot be bought, shipped west, or listed on a price sheet at 75 cents. It is built by repetition, and repetition is exactly what a cheap tool permits, and an expensive one discourages. The mountain men did not have a miraculous knife. They had an ordinary one, and 10,000 hours with it. So go back to the beginning. 6 tools on a shelf, each better at its single job than anything a trapper ever carried, and 1 line of handwriting from 1826. Butcher knives, 75 cents each. The remarkable thing was never that one blade could do the work of 6 modern tools. It couldn't, not without limits, compromises, and a stone in constant use. The remarkable thing is how much capability a man could build around one cheap piece of steel once he stopped treating it as precious and started treating it as an extension of his hands. Most of those knives are gone now. Worn to nothing, lost in river bottoms, thrown out with the trash of trading posts that burned or were pulled down for lumber. The ones that lasted by accident, and they survive worn thin, reshaped, patched, and unbeautiful. I have never been able to look at one of those ground-down blades as damage. It is a record. Every missing fraction of an inch is an hour of somebody's life. If that is the kind of history you want, the object rather than the legend, the ledger rather than the poster, you already know where you belong. There is another story on this channel about the frontier tools that got left out of the myth entirely. Start there.